Welcome to the second part of today's session. It is my pleasure to introduce Bridget Copley. She's researcher at the CNRS in Paris and in University Paris 8. Um, and the talk she's giving today is titled Causation as the B-side of modality.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a great conference so far. This is really, I didn't go to the conference last time, but I'm surely going to try to make everyone from now on. All right, so I want to talk about causation and modality. Now, the claim I'm going to be making throughout this is that causation and modality are kind of two sides of the same coin. And I'm not the first one to have said this, but I want to reimagine the coin as a record, okay? Now, for those of us old enough to remember, it used to be that record companies would send singles, like vinyl singles, to radio stations. And on one side would be the side that they wanted to hit, right? That this was the song that they thought they would be a hit, and that was called the A side. But, you know, a record has two sides, so they would put something on the other side, and that was the B side. And usually, yeah, the A side was the hit and the B side, whatever. Okay, but sometimes the B side was better than the A side. So I don't know if you've ever heard of these songs. 13 Women by Bill Haley and his Comets, Substitute by Gloria Gaynor, Train Nowhere by the Champs, right? Nobody knows these, but their B-sides were very familiar. Okay, so if you look at these, you've probably heard of those songs. Okay, and that's what I want to claim is going on here with modality as the A side. It's the side of the record that everybody uses for all kinds of things because it's very powerful. But the B side, I want to say, is actually sometimes better and sometimes more useful. Okay, so that's the claim I'm going to make here. And here's how I'm going to make it. I'm going to use these terms, modal theory and causal theory. So modal theory, for our purposes, is going to be quantification over possible worlds, all right? And of course, it was originally developed, starting with modal logic, and later extended to many other linguistic phenomena, right? So modal theory, I want to say, is the A side. Causal theory is the B side. It's related, and I'm going to talk about how it's related. But it's just as powerful as modal theory, but in a slightly different way, right? We can get two very powerful theories out of these, and they can broadly account for truth conditions, right? They're good theories, okay? But sometimes the B side is going to be better because it can get other facts too. So today I'm going to talk about the imperfective paradox and English progressives, all right? To try and convince you that in these cases, the B side is better. The last part of the talk is going to be a sort of looking at the big picture here. So we're going to see that listening to the B-side in this way leads us to a certain view of semantic models that's maybe a bit surprising, but should also be somewhat familiar. So, so that's what we'll get to there. All right. So let's talk about modal theory. And again, by modal theory, I mean quantification over primitive possible worlds. Okay. So here's a quote from David Lewis, who needs no introduction to this audience, I think. He is interested in causation in this quote, right? So he's interested in talking about causation as being linked to counterfactuality. Now, in which direction are causation and counterfactuality linked? Is it that we derive causation from counterfactuality? Counterfactuality gives us causation, so that's A, and that's the way that modal theory goes. But there's an alternative, and this is the B side, that causation gives us counterfactuality. I'm going to call this view causal theory. Now, we already know that David Lewis chose the A side. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about why. So why has to do with Lewis's deep conviction, following David Hume, that complex concepts, including causation, right, were able to be broken down to very, very simple local facts and regularities behind them. I mean, and this is, I'm not knocking this heuristic, right? This is the heuristic that has brought us all of science in a way. But what David Lewis, what this meant for David Lewis was that because he had this absolute commitment that we could break everything down to this Humean mosaic of local matters of particular fact in actual and possible worlds. Because of this commitment, and because he had a Humean mosaic theory of counterfactuality, his answer was, let's explain causation away. Causation is something that's not legitimate to talk about. And Hume had this view in a way too, right? But David Lewis's answer was absolutely the A side. Counterfactuality is what gives us a notion of causation. We have to derive a notion of causation. So how did he do this? Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, so I'm just going to tell you what his starting point was. So let's suppose that we want to know what the meaning of the word cause is. And here we have this situation where the agent, the switch is in the off position, the agent comes in and flips the switch and the light goes on. Okay. So did A cause B? All right, that's the question we're asking. And he's going to relate A caused B to the sentence, if A hadn't occurred, B wouldn't have occurred. Okay. Now, again, if you know this paper, this is just where he starts, okay? But I'm not going to go into all the details. What we're going to do is evaluate this counterfactual. And for David Lewis, we're talking about worlds that are more or less similar to the actual world. They're going to be more similar to the actual world the greater the spatiotemporal region of perfect match of particular fact before A's occurrence is, okay? So the way this plays out is that if A hadn't occurred, B wouldn't have occurred is true in the actual world if there's a no A, no B world that's closer to world 0 than any no A, yes B world. Okay, so here, if the agent decides against it, that's a closer world. That keeps us from picking out this as a closer world, right? So what we say is that if A hadn't occurred, B wouldn't have occurred is true because we have this, there's a closer world where if the agent doesn't do it, it doesn't happen, okay? Sorry, where the agent doesn't do it and it doesn't happen, okay? All right, so the idea here is simply that he's explaining causation in terms of counterfactuality because he specifically wants to explain away causation. And because we're talking about generative linguistics in this conference, I just want to mention that there's a bit of a founder effect in generative linguistics. So we know what a founder effect is. It's where you have certain things in a region and only there's this great diversity in that region, but then only some of them get out. And so perhaps all over the world, there's less diversity than in that one region. And so I have these apples here because apparently apples are from Kazakhstan and there's more varieties of apples in Kazakhstan than there are anywhere else. Okay, so that's the founder effect. And I think something like this happened with generative linguistics, thinking about causation. There are a lot of different theories of causation, and not all philosophers believe with David Lewis that you have to explain causation away in terms of something else. But what happened was David Dowdy adopted David Lewis's theory. And so I believe that we have in generative linguistics this sort of impression that causation is complex, it needs to be explained away, we can't really deal with it, we leave it to the philosophers. And it's sort of ironic because not all the philosophers believe as David Lewis does. I also want to mention that cognitive linguistics did not at all inherit this impression. And if you know the work of Leonard Talmy talking about force dynamics, sort of around the same time that David Dowdy was, sort of in between David Lewis's causation paper and David Doughty's book. So they were dealing with, configurations of forces as explicating, as describing causation, and there was no need to explain it away in terms of something else. Okay. Now, just to finish up with modal theory, so the last step in this is that Angelika Kratzer took modal theory and made it flexible and powerful. And again, probably this audience knows exactly what Kratzer added to this. It's in this column here. I won't talk about it. But the point of this slide is that what this did was made it possible to use modal theory for all kinds of issues in the semantics of natural language. Okay, I mean, this is a list of just about every. I mean, okay, it's not everything in natural language semantics, but this is a huge chunk of it, right? And including aspect with progressives, which we'll talk about today. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about as modal theory having gone platinum. Okay, so the A side is a big hit, right? And deservedly so, because it's a great theory. Okay. But what about the B side? Oh, I put an asterisk here. I meant to say dynamic causal models. Okay, so that's what causal theory is. Oh, by the way, let me put in the chat. Where's the chat? What is the chat called? There it is. Okay, let me put a link to my handout. Because that way, if you want to look at it, and yes, it's telling me I'm presenting. Yes, I am presenting. Okay. All right. So if you the link to the handout is in the chat. So if you want to take a look at it and go back and look at slides, you can. All right. So the claim is that causal theory is the B side of modal theory. And remember, we were talking about causation and counterfactuality. Okay. So Lewis says, aha, we're going to derive causation in terms of counterfactuality. But we have another option. We can do the other way around. Okay. So what does it look like when we do it the other way around? Okay. Now okay. Again, I'm using this broad term causal theory to talk about this. On this slide, it's a static causal model. It's static because there's only one of it, right? And we're going to add counterfactuality into our definition of causation, okay? So when A caused B is true, we're going to represent it by representing a direction of influence from A to B. And we're going to have a valuation function that tells us how the value of A influences the value of B. So the one I have here with the equal sign, that gives you sort of, I'm notating with this equal sign here an equal function. So A equals B, basically. But it's not just A equals B, because you also have this causation here, right? You have a relation that is presumed to be causation, and it has a direction, okay? Now, if we wanted prevent, we'd have a not equals function here, that when you have A, B is prevented, and when you don't have A, B happens, okay? So that's just to say what the function can do. If A were different, so if we're going to think about what happens if the agent doesn't turn on the light switch, then we correspond, then this line is the one we look at. And this line corresponds to world 1 over here, okay? So basically, we've represented world 0 and world 1. What about these other worlds? Okay. Right now, they're not represented, but we still have representation of counterfactuality to some extent in here, okay? And we're going to see how to get more of them. We're going to make these dynamic, okay? So when this starts working, we're going to see that an adequate theory of causation is going to have some counterfactuality written into their definitions of causal relations. So there's no extra need to appeal to possible worlds or additional counterfactual statements. We have it baked into causation. Okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about these causal models, and then we're going to make them dynamic. Causal models represent the structure, or a structure, that causation gives to our conception of the world. Each node is a variable that can have different values. We've just kind of seen that. An arrow from A to B represents that the value of B is dependent on or listens to the value. Sorry, it should be the value of B is dependent on or listens to the value of A, and that this dependency is causal. Okay, it gives a direction to this arrow, right? What do we mean by listen to? Well, it means that if the value of A, so here alpha, if the value of alpha is different, that means something for the value of gamma. And we can see that it does, right? So here alpha, you can only have gamma if there's alpha, right? If alpha is 0, you can't have gamma be true. And the same thing with beta, right? The value of beta influences the value of gamma. The value of gamma listens to the value of beta. And you can see that this, in this structure, we have, they call it a collider. So you have two influences on something else. Now, the nature of these influences is represented by this function, okay? And here's a reference for a good introduction to this. Now, we should note that the same structure can be used with a different valuation function. So here's a different one, same structure. But now, instead of talking about matches and fires, we're talking about a sort of prevention scenario. This function doesn't need to be any function we've heard, it doesn't need to be and or anything like that. It can be anything that we have for moral knowledge. And again, the lines in this valuation table are going to correspond to at least some of the possible worlds in modal theory. And we can also note that you can say which line of the table you're in. So we can do that and say, well, okay, the plug is engaged, there's water in the sink, and the sink isn't draining. Okay. All right. What they are not. So they're not to be read as cause, although I'll probably do that at some point. But strictly speaking, they're influence, right? Or this listening, because you can also have preventions. It's a bit like force dynamics, but not quite. The nodes can be used to represent the existence or non-existence of Thomaian forces. Whoops. The arrows are not the material conditional. The arrows do not denote an accessibility relation between worlds. And the nodes are not literally events, but they're weather statements. So this is why I've been writing them with question marks, right? Because really the node has the sort of counterfactuality built in, and that's why, it's whatever value of alpha it is, the value of gamma is going to listen to it, okay? So you can talk about events in these statements, but they're not strictly speaking themselves events. All right. So, okay, so I want to make a crazy analogy, and this may be something that I don't know if the philosophers have the background for this, but if you're a linguist and you've heard of, or even if you're not a linguist, it keeps telling me I'm presenting. Okay. If you're not a linguist and if you've heard of phonology, this is a fun analogy. So optimality theory is a phonological theory that treats phonological representations as generated by first generating all the possibilities and then winnowing down the set to the ones you want. And you can see how modal theory is kind of like that. You have all the possible worlds, and then you pick out the set that you want. I want to say that causal theory is like transformational phonology. So this is more like you have a situation. Okay, let's see. In the causal theory, you have a situation, and then it becomes another situation. Something becomes true, right? With transformational phonology, you take a phonological form and you operate on it, and so the form changes. So in that sense, I think this is a good analogy to say that on the left side, we're generating all the possibilities and picking out a set, whereas on the right side, we're just saying what happens, right? We're following a course of events in a way. Okay. All right, so let's get these guys dynamic. So dynamic just well, dynamic is a funny word, but here we're going to use it to mean changing. All right, so what happens? Let's suppose that you have a switch and you have a light, and your view of this switch and this light is that they are causally connected. So if you turn the switch on, or if the switch is on, the light turns on or the light is on. Okay. And we've seen this. I've actually, from here, I'm going to be using this equal sign to say this table, right? Just so we don't have to write this table the whole time. Okay, so that's your view of the world. But look what happens. You turn on the switch and the light doesn't go on. So what's the matter with your model? Well, your model doesn't predict this, right? Because your model says, well, when A is 1, that's going to cause B to become 1. But in fact, it didn't. So now your model is out of accord with the actual world. And in fact, we can say it's specifically this truth value of the B node that is the problem, right? The light didn't turn on. And there is no line in this table that has A is 1 and B is 0, right? So what do? Well, we add another influence. So let's start it this way. Let's say that, okay, well, we had this model where A influenced B, but now we think that there's got to be another influence on B that makes it 0. It could be anything, maybe the wire is wet or the wire is broken, and it gives us a problem. Now, we could try to put this in a truth valuation table like we have here, but I want to point out some things about this valuation table. One issue is that we don't actually know what y is. Okay, we know there's something that wants b to be 0, but we don't know what it is. Okay, so I've put these variables for truth values. We're not used to seeing variables for truth values, but I've put these in there to show that, well, y could be preventing it, or it could be, we just don't have anything, we don't know anything about y except that it's making b 0. By the way, I call these nodes y because it's, why? Why is b 0? Okay. Now, the other thing to notice about this is that there's actually something wrong here. The arrow from A to B is no longer licensed, okay? Remember that to have an arrow, you have to have the truth value of B listen to the truth value of A, but it doesn't. It makes no difference whether A is 0 or 1, okay? So in fact, we no longer have that arrow. In fact, we just have Y influencing B. And because of that, what I want to do is separate these functions out and just say, well, Y has this kind of thing. We're in this kind of world. I'm going to notate that, although I don't seem to have here, by saying that Y wants B to be 0. Okay, we'll see that in future slides. Okay, all right. So that I want to call this whole process remodeling. Okay, this is a process by which we have a model in our head, and then the world sort of contradicts it, and we create a new model. All right. And I want to use this for the imperfective paradox and progressives. All right, so let's see how we do that. The imperfective paradox. Okay, Mary is crossing the street, but she won't make it across. Why is this a problem, other than for Mary? It's a problem because if you want to say that there's a progressive operating on the verb phrase or the proposition, Mary crossed the street, then somehow you have to find a way to undo the completion so that Mary is crossing the street doesn't convey completion. Okay, so here's a question. Should we use modal theory, the A side, with this, or should we use causal theory, the B side? And again, the choice between them is generally not one of truth conditions, okay? They're both powerful theories. They can do whatever they want. So you may be familiar with Portner 98, who took a Kratzerian analysis of the progressive, and it's reminiscent of what we saw with David Lewis's causation. We're picking out the best worlds, and we're saying that the best worlds are certain worlds. What's going on here is that we're saying the best worlds are the ones in which the event is completed, okay? And he's able to define this in a certain way. Okay, so this is how we get around this problem of non-completion. We say that, well, it's completed on the best worlds, and it's true that the actual world may not turn out to be one of the best worlds, okay? But we have all these other possibilities because we generated all the possibilities, and we're going to say that, okay, these are, we could definitely end up in another world, and in that case, we don't get the completion. All right. But there's a couple problems with this. So one problem is a problem if you care about the syntax-semantics interface. And yes, generative linguistics generally cares about the syntax-semantics interface. So the morphosyntax should map easily to the meaning, right? But what are we doing with this? So we have prog that takes P, the whole proposition, as its argument. What is that? So here, let's say we have P represented low down in this tree. We need an operator that's either pronounced B, or maybe we leave B alone and we make a null operator somewhere else, so that it can be a sister of P and allow us to have this meaning that say Portner has proposed. But I'm not happy with B being progressive, and I'm not so happy with the null head being progressive. Null heads are something that we love in generative linguistics generally, because they allow us to make syntax work out well, and occasionally make semantics work out well. But I feel like this is a bridge too far, right? There's all this modal meaning in prog here, and there's no good candidate to host it, okay? Another problem, and it's maybe a related problem, is that the English progressive comes historically from a locative construction. So if you see in this Old English, there he was on hunting. That on is a preposition, okay? And indeed, Bybee et al. 1994, they have a survey of about 70 or 80 languages on tense and aspect and modality, and they found that plurality of progressives came from locatives, okay? And you can see this in French as well. So you have progressive meanings coming from locatives all the time. How are they going to get a modal meaning? What the heck, right? Okay. So obviously what I want to do here is ditch modal theory. We don't like the A side. Let's try the B side, okay? Let's see what happens. And I want to go exactly back to this notion of remodeling that we saw with the light switch. We'll say that Mary has a certain property at a time, and this is going to influence whether a result occurs, okay? And the result is going to be that she crosses the street successfully. So if you say Mary is crossing the street, maybe you have this in mind. Oops, she turned around. Well, now you've given yourself a truth value that is inexplicable, right? So again, if P is 1, we have to have R be 1, but it's not. So what do? We're going to remodel as before. We're going to make the model differently. There's my notation. So this notation of Y with a colon and 0 is meant to say that Y wants R to be 0. Okay. So can we take the imperfective paradox to be a case of remodeling, just like the light switch? So what might be evidence that this is the way to do it? Well, the first two on this list are the things we talked about that were problems with the modal theory, right? So if we can get those, explained by using this, then maybe we're doing a little better. There's a couple of other questions we'd like to answer too. Is there a good candidate for the causing property P? You'll notice I was very coy about what this property might be. Okay, but we'd like to know, is there a good candidate or candidates? Are there good candidates for it? And then we'd also like to know, can this causal story account for the lack of the imperfective paradox for certain predicates? Okay. So I'm going to say that if we can hit all these 4 targets, we're on a pretty good path, and we're doing better than the modal theory. Okay. So can we get a cleaner syntax semantics interface? I think we can. There's a consensus in linguistics that many verb phrases involve a causal relation of some kind, associated with the verbal lexical semantics or a verbal head. So we can get a causal meaning for free from the verb phrase, unlike the proposed modal meaning, which we saw doesn't really fit in anywhere. I had a thought. What was the thought? Right. So, and remember that using this causal this causal arrow is going to get us some counterfactuality, and then viewing causal models as something that we have a dynamic system in, a dynamic system of, is going to get us the rest of counterfactuality. So we actually can ditch the possible worlds. All right. So I think that's a yes. Can it get us the grammaticization facts? I think it can. So we have some sort of historical locative meaning, and I've expanded this tree now to put what would be a historical prepositional phrase in there. It does make sense, right? So with this causal structure, what we're trying to do is we're trying to locate X in the first node of the causal structure. And because it's complex, right, you could see how it might be like saying somebody's in front of a house, right? You're standing in some relation to the house. And in this case, the relation is that you're the holder of this property here. Okay, but the whole thing you're being related to is here. Now, this could also be a complex property on its own, and I think that's probably what's going on synchronically. There's no more preposition there. So presumably ing is making the verb into a nominal of type et, and you're just going to predicate the subject of that nominal. Okay. So, and there's no problem syntactically with the prepositional phrase. Your subject is going to raise through whatever it needs to raise through. It's going to get all the right, it's going to get its thematic roll down below, and it's going to raise, and that's fine. Okay, so I think this is a yes as well. Oh, okay, I just wanted to take this slide to say, yeah, that this is what we're going to say, that ing is going to take the causal structure and make it a nominal. The subject is going to go here. The object, if there is one, is going to go here. And then subject BV ing is that is going to say something temporal, right? That the reference time is within the time that the property P holds of the subject. Okay, so I think this is a yes. Number 3, are there good candidates for the causing property P? I think there are. So we're looking for a property that holds of the subject throughout the time that the progressive subject sentence is true, right? That's what the temporal thing needs to do. And then we, of course, want the value of the result node to listen to its value. So here's an inspirational quote from Levine and Rappaport Hovav. So they're talking about internally caused eventualities, such as flowers blooming and so forth. So they're talking about properties. You know, property of the flower causes the blooming to happen. But in the same breath, they actually say that for agentive verbs such as play and speak, the property is the will or volition of the agent who performs the activity. Okay, so will, volition, desire, intention. I'm not going to make a huge distinction between those, but that's what I want to say can be property P. So we can have an intentional property, you know, having the intention, or we can have unintentional properties, non-intentional properties. Now, I understand that for a lot of people, the idea of an intention being involved in causation is not a very palatable one. And so maybe if this is you, maybe we can talk about this in the questions about whether it helps. I mean, it's not even clear we need the label cause here. So if we could have the formal structure where you have a dependency and a direction, maybe that's enough if it were to be called by a different name. So we should talk about that. But certainly linguistically, there's nothing preventing us from saying that the cause can either be an intention or something else, just in the way that Levine and Rappaport have said this. You can have, well, okay, let me put it this way. Intentions, if you have an intentional action, the intention is going to last throughout the action, okay? If you change your intention in the middle of the action, you're going to stop your action. Or if something about your understanding of the intention changes, right? So you can always have you could be crossing the street, but have the misapprehension that you're doing something else. So you could have an intention to do something else and end up crossing the street. Okay? So even if you do things accidentally, some accidental actions are intentional. They just don't happen because of the right intention. They happen because of an intention for something else. That's okay. And we can surely have non-intentional causing properties for animate entities the same way we would want to for inanimate entities. So if you say Mary or the branch broke the window by falling against it, both of those are fine. And what seems to be going on is that it's a property of the branch or Mary, but it's not an intentional property. It's the momentum and the direction and so forth. So I think it's okay to say that the causing property could be an intention or not. Remember, we need something that holds throughout the event so that we can get the progressive meaning. And I think this is a pretty good candidate. I will maybe skip this. I want to talk about another reason why intentions can be the causing property P. But we can go back to that if we feel like it. Okay. So our fourth criterion was, can we account for the lack of imperfective paradox for certain predicates? Yes, I think we can. Okay. So I want to claim that unergatives are like accomplishments. They're still causal, but essentially the reason. What's going on is that you've got an intention, again, that happens throughout the intentional action, but the result is happening at the same time, more or less immediately, okay, whatever the result is. So the result is going to have a real truth value at time t. It's not going to have a derived truth value. It's not in parentheses, right? It's not a truth value I only get from the model. It's one I've actually verified with the world. What is this result? Well, in the case of dancing, Harley 2005 says it's the creation of an abstract object. It's the creation of some dance. Okay, and we should note that it's very easy with causal models to represent entraining causation, such that results can occur while the cause is occurring. I mean, this is weird because it's a normal part of life. Like I can push on this mug. The pushing is causing the mug to move, but the pushing and the moving happen at the same time. Davidsonian event semantic kind of don't let us say that very well. And there's also been this weird idea that results always need to be states. They don't need to be states all the time. Okay, so the idea here is that because the result occurs as soon as any action takes place, the truth value of R is real. It's not merely derived in the model. So no remodeling is possible and no imperfective paradox happens. Okay. We can do the same thing for unaccusatives. Now, it's not clear to me whether unaccusatives have the imperfective property or not. But the question here is, does a little bit of the change already occur? And notice there's no causal relation in these. I think that's probably how we want to represent these. And so progressives that take verbs like this, that represents an extension from the historical domain of the progressive. There's no agent here, right? So it's the theme, it's the undergoer of the change that is our X, right, our subject. So, but the question, as before, is going to be, well, can we remodel this truth value? And the idea is probably not. Okay. But if, that hinges on whether a little of the change has already occurred. Okay. All right. Okay, so I've been through these. We had a better interface. We get grammaticization. I think there's good candidates for causing property P, and I think we can account for the lack of imperfective paradox. So I'm going to say that causal theory, the B side, can do a better job than modal theory, and that this is one of these cases where the B side is actually better. Okay, but what has remodeling done to semantic models? So this, I just want to step back a bit and say, if we have this picture, what does that mean for what we think a model is and does? All right, so now I'm going to entirely switch. I'm going to mix my metaphors, right? We've been talking about the record. Okay, we're not going to talk about the record for this section of the talk. Instead, we're going to use a different metaphor, that of a map. Okay, so you've probably heard this phrase. People sometimes say the map is not the territory, but the actual quote is, a map is not the territory it represents. But if corrected, as a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness. Okay, so let's think of some things about maps. First of all, we know that not everything in the territory needs to be represented in the map. There's a Borges story, is that right? That has a map that is a one-to-one representation of the territory itself, and it's clear that that's ridiculous, right? So we expect our maps to not represent everything, and I mean it almost goes without saying, but the map represents what is expected to be found in reality. It's under no obligation to represent the things that we don't expect to find, right? That would be very strange. So now there's a third point, and I have to introduce it by imagining ourselves on an island that's volcanic. So let's suppose that the terrain of the island is changing all the time, okay? So you might notice that, well, you had a map and it was good, but now it's no longer good. It's out of accord with reality, and it should be changed, in fact, because what use is a map that doesn't accord with reality? So what I'm saying here, and maybe you can see where I'm going with this, is that maps in this sense on this island, where things change all the time. We expect them to be dynamic. We expect them to change. So we see that that's kind of what we've been doing here. And what I want to say is that a semantic model is a map. It is not the territory, okay? It doesn't need to represent everything. It doesn't need to represent what we don't expect to find, and it should change when it falls out of accord with reality. Now, if we think about a branching time model, so if we go back to modal theory, not everything in the territory needs to be represented. Okay, maybe, but I'm not sure that that's not really a founding principle of modal theory at all. And we seem to be under an obligation to represent everything in modal theory, right? We generated all the possibilities and then winnowed it down. And for sure, we don't give up the model just because something unexpected happens, right? Because we have all the possibilities, we don't need to. So modal theory is like this big thing that represents everything, but it's not like a map. What I want to claim here is that maybe it's well, certainly that if we go this side B causal route, we're going to find ourselves in the business of having our semantic models be more like maps. And they'll be able to express everything we need them to express. They're not going to be deterministic because we have causation and we have built in with the dynamicity the ability to represent things that are unexpected. But at the same time, the map, simply represents what is expected. Okay, so
Bridget, you have spoken for 40 minutes.
Okay, great, thanks. So with modal theory, it's like we've been given a magic card, magic get out of jail free card. Boy, I'm really mixing my metaphors, but we're able to get out of determinism by generating all of the possible worlds. But what I'm saying here is that maybe that's not the way to go, or maybe that's not the way to go in every case. Instead, we can avoid determinism by having our models be dynamic, essentially. Okay, so I think that is going to bring us to the conclusion. So as I said, modal theory, causal theory, they're two sides of the same coin, but we want to see the coin as a record because modal theory has been so much more successful. But I wanted to re-examine, could we do this with causal theory? And in fact, should we do it in some cases? And I argued that in the case of the English progressive and with the imperfective paradox, we probably should, because it gives us better results. And we can do the things that we want to do. And if we go this route, it's while we're thinking about what this means for our models, it means that they're more like maps and not like the territory. Okay, thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much. If you have questions, please raise your hand. Peter?
By the way, I'm a big fan of this whole approach to problems, and I love the idea of turning something upside down, like you did with modality and causality. I have a question though about how far you can go with the causality with respect to progressives. So you had the example earlier of the flowers are growing.
Yeah.
So what's the causal agent there?
Yeah. So if we're going to follow Levine and Rappaport, there's no agent. There need not be an agent. There's just an entity that has a property, and what I would say here is that whether the bloom happens depends on the property, on the flower having that property.
All right. So then in the little graph, it's like the arrow. So one circle is the property, and then that's the arrow to the result of growing.
Yeah. So it's just like this. Well, I'm going to is growing like blooming, maybe. So the structure is like this. The property is whether the flower has this particular property. And the result is probably the growing or the blooming or the dancing. Now, what does that mean? And here's where I said, well, okay, these are things that are happening at the same time. You have this property holding, and you have a change taking place. But a change can be a result, or the existence of a change can be a result, right? There's nothing stopping us from saying that. So does that?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I can live with that for now. Let me just very briefly, there is some stuff on ancient accounts of causality that involve intentionality built into them.
Oh.
Which might want to look that up at some point, since you were thinking that was I sensed you were thinking that was a weird idea, but it's in the books. Thank you.
Yeah, I talk to people, and I honestly, like, I understand it's a heuristic that one can hold. I just don't hold it, and so yeah, it's thanks for that.
Okay, Daniel.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I think my question is basically about some of the later material. So this metaphor with the map. I'm very sympathetic to this idea of implementing the causal models. But there's something that I still like about the modal picture, even if I can easily be swayed into the idea that it needs to be changed. And what I like about it is that we get truth conditions really easily. Once we have truth conditions, then we can do all sorts of things like entailments and what have you. And it wasn't as clear to me how you would do quite the same thing with like the map picture. I mean, I guess you could say like, well, this map is wrong, right? Or like, this is not a good map. Or I guess you could say it's not a good map if the map is wrong, right? If the map says something that's there that's not there. But it might be a good map for one purpose and not for others. And so I guess what I'm saying is that like we seem to have now like a really more complicated picture of kind of what the semantics is doing, of semantic evaluation. And like, do we still get something like truth conditions? Do we not need them really anymore? Or like what happens with that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a really, really good question. And it's at the heart of this. I kind of meant to talk about it, but I somehow missed this at the end. But so yeah, let me say a little bit about that now. So one of the things that this view does is to take us from a view where you have a sentence, it's evaluated on a model, and you get a truth value. Instead, what you have is you have a sentence. It constructs a model. Maybe this model goes in the common ground, something like that. Okay. And somehow, okay, so this model has truth values in it, right? And we're going to keep track of truth values that are ratified against reality, let's say, and those that are not, right? Those that are just in the model. And those are the things that we're maybe committed to as a speaker. But we're also not surprised if things happen differently, because, the one thing we can guarantee about any time we talk about the future or even just what happens next is that things can go wrong, right? So I agree. It's a more complex situation, and I haven't given an answer here for how that works. How do you map reality to the whole model to get us truth conditions? I mean, I think it'll be in some ways obvious, but right. I mean, it's like you can see looking at models like this. Well, we should be able to check, right? I mean, there's something that's telling us that this truth value marked with an exclamation point is not what we expected. So here we expected a 1, and because it's happening in the future, I put it in parentheses. I think I forgot to say that. But here it's a 0. So I mean, in some sense, it's it's obvious. Like we can tell, but how exactly to do it? Yeah, you're right. There's some more work that needs to be done there, and some more pragmatics for sure, to see how this, how do we, I was playing fast and loose with this here. Yeah, I have a little discourse here, but how do you get that model, which is maybe in the common ground? How do you know, oops, she turned around, that you're talking about the same model that you were talking about with Mary is crossing the street? So that's pragmatics, and I haven't done any of that here. But anyway, we're hoping to hear from a pragmaticist and say how you do that sort of thing. But that's the kind of thing that needs to be done.
Cool. Thank you.
Julie.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Bridget. That's a great metaphor with A and B side. And what I was wondering, what I wanted you to tell us is how far you want to push this as an opposition, or us having to make a choice. You kind of started to talk about Lewis, but Lewis's model view is not the only way to interpret Kripke's model logic and the way this tool, not the only way to use this tool. then you said that you're not happy with Faulkner's progressive, but his account is not the only way to do the Ramchand's is another account. So there are accounts that we can be happy about. So I was wondering, how do we really need to set up as an opposition, or can we use both tools?
I think that we can certainly, like, I'm not saying down with modal theory at all. I think that maybe modal theory should stay in its lane. Maybe we can figure out what its lane is. I think that for these reasons about the syntax semantics interface and grammaticization, I think those are the strongest arguments that, here we are in the lower part of the verb phrase where we know causation is. Why can't we use that instead of maybe importing some meaning that happens to give it the right truth conditions, but doesn't fit at all with the syntax semantics interface or the Daltonic facts? So it's that kind of argument. Now, if you're asking, can we use these at the same time? I mean, I guess this is the conversation that you and I are having. It's like, are these two sides of the same coin? Are these kind of are they notational? To what extent are they notational variants of each other?
Well, I was thinking about slightly differently. Are they sides of the same coin, or are they parts of the same coin, of the same face of the coin?
Okay. Can you tell?
No, I think we need to give the floor.
Okay.
But I'm just I wanted you to say to people that.
That's great. Let's put a pin in that.
What you're saying.
We'll talk about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Julie.
you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Before Martina asks her question, Brenda, I think I saw that you raised your hand.
Yes, I did. But I'm happy to have Martina's question first. That's no problem.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. I love this talk. Thank you. I'm wondering whether you've looked at acquisition and whether there could be an argument made from there, because as far as I know, kids are very early with understanding causation, but I'm not sure about modality, and like also with the acquisition of the constructions that you're interested in. So that might be an interesting avenue for exploring this idea. Have you looked at that?
Thank you. No, I haven't. I mean, what I know about kids and causation is that they're really good at agency, perhaps as, I mean, that's kind of interacting with the world, right? But that counterfactuality, and maybe even that they have the pieces of counterfactuality. So they may understand that, that if you do this, this happens, and if you do this, that happens, but they just can't put it together in their mind in time to understand that if you had done this, because that involves this extra step, right?
Yeah.
So, I know. I think that's a really good.
That to me seems like an argument if you want to figure out what derives from the other, counterfactual from causality, or the other way around. Like the kids, I think, give a very clear picture of what it should be.
Absolutely. And the other point here too is that, again, I'm not trying to get rid of modal theory. We know that language has different ways to skin sort of the same cat at different layers and structure.
Exactly.
So like in Slavic we have or Russian we have a imperfective, and then we have perfective stems that have a secondary imperfective built on them. So I think that could be really neat to explore with acquisition, how kids might acquire that. That's really cool. Thanks.
If Peter does not mind, I think it would be nice to take a few minutes so that Bridget can answer the two last questions. Brenda.
Yes, I'll try to be very brief. Thank you for your talk, Bridget. It was great listening to you again. I think my question is related to Peter Loloff's question, and it is the following. I mean, since we only have the imperfective paradox with accomplishments and with achievements that can be turned into accomplishment in some way, I'm very sympathetic to the causation approach, But what do you think about, I don't know if you're familiar with them, with some recent approaches which are displacing the problem into the semantic of accomplishments? I mean, the imperfective paradox is not a problem of the imperfective. It is a problem of the semantic of approaches of the semantics of accomplishments. And you can build your causal structure, your causal model inside the semantic of accomplishments without having to enter into the problem of trees, plants flowering, and trees growing, and so on. That's
what do you have in mind specifically? Because I'm not recognizing.
Prananaratur, and I cannot remember the name
and
of the second author.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. So okay, so they're trying to give kind of exactly what Daniel was asking about, which is sort of truth conditions for these statements, and they I have another talk where I show how, so they have a sort of causal network. So if you bake a cake, right, you have to do certain things, and they show, well, under what's the causal model look like if I'm baking a cake is true. And they're right. I mean, I think they're absolutely right. The problem is it's not compositional, right? There's no way to get all these things. So I have another talk where I show how you can relate this very simple 2-node thing to their network. And I think that's going to be how that works. Thanks.
Thank you.
Earlier, there was another question in the queue. Nilanjan, do you want to ask your question?
Oh yes, thank you for remembering that I had a question. Thanks for the talk. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. I just have two questions that may not be particularly relevant. One question is this. There's causation on the B side. So are there any other of the characters on the Platinum edition which can join causation? And the second question is, are there any other characters on the Platinum, in the Platinum edition, that can join causation on the B side? And what is it about causation that makes it go on the B side?
Well, I guess I just meant it as a historical observation that, that there's been a lot of success with modal theory. And I think there has been a lot of success, because it's so flexible and it's so powerful. Like, it absolutely deserves all the success it has. But what I want to say about causation is that, I mean, because of this founder effect that as linguists, maybe we think that, oh, causation is something we leave to the philosophers. We just write cause and we say, okay, that we're not going to deal with that. But if we do that, we miss the possibility of putting counterfactuality in these other ways, by the lines in the valuation table and by dynamicity. And so that, I think, is the only reason why it's the B side, is because, we as a field didn't really see the potential in causal relations to bring all this other stuff with them. So it's meant to be a historical observation more than anything else.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Bridget, once again.